Howdy, and welcome to a bonus episode of Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. Wow, what a last couple of weeks. We had a Category 4 hurricane hit the Texas coast on August the 25th, and that hurricane created a historic rain event for the United States, all of which occurred in the general vicinity of Houston. And I thought that I would spend a little bit of time kind of informing the listeners who aren't around the Houston area and the Port Aransas, Rockport area, what we have been through and where we're headed. Now, throughout this podcast, I've mentioned that I have a lot of personal connections to a lot of the Texas history stories we've covered due to my ancestors being here so long, but this particular Texas history event happened in our time, and that's sort of strange to think about. You're living through a historic weather event in Texas. Texas history, actually 50 inches of Texas history, fell right on top of the world headquarters of Wise About Texas. Now, at the outset, let me tell you, I did not personally flood, thank goodness. Was very lucky. My parents on the northeast side of Houston did, in fact, flood, and many of my friends had their homes flooded, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It is a rare thing that you get to live through a historic event, so I just thought that we needed to talk about it, and it certainly delayed the production schedule as we watched the rain come down and prepared for what might happen, but we're going to get back on schedule here. The kids are back in school, and things are starting to get back to as normal as they can be, given what had happened. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Hurricane Harvey. I mentioned Harvey was a Category 4, and it passed right over Rockport, Texas. In fact, I did an episode a while back on St. Joseph's Island, an island that Franklin Roosevelt visited back in the 30s, and the storm made landfall right over St. Joseph's Island. And it's interesting to think about all the hurricanes that have passed over that island. I also mentioned in that St. Joseph's Island episode that I do a little duck hunting right there in St. Charles Bay, right on the other side of St. Joe's Island. And if you put a map dot right on top of where I hunt, the line that was Hurricane Harvey's track runs right through the left half of that dot. So Hurricane Harvey made landfall right over a spot where I spend a significant amount of time. Another unfortunate personal connection to this historic event. Interestingly, Harvey is only the second Category 4 to hit that area of Texas. The Indianola hurricane of 1886 was the other one. Now, obviously, Racer Storm that we've discussed on this show in 1837 was probably a 5+. The 1900 storm that hit Galveston certainly was a 5. But they hit other places in Texas. One of the more interesting things about Harvey was that storm strengthened from a tropical depression off the coast of Mexico to a Category 4 hurricane in only 56 hours. Now, I personally have never seen anything like that. And I don't know, the meteorologists in the audience might have some more information in that, but Harvey accelerated and grew very, very quickly. If you go back and listen to the episode I did on series of episodes on the 1900 storm, I talk a lot about how hurricanes form. And for this one, it just started spinning faster and faster as it got closer to land. And so by the time it made landfall, it was a very, very significant hurricane. I want to mention Rockport and Port Aransas. The pictures I've seen, both the public pictures and the private pictures I've received from friends down there, are not good. The buildings down there were demolished, most of them. There probably isn't a building in the area not affected in some way. Had friends with places down there that were destroyed and friends with places that made it through, as always happens in a hurricane. The house next door might be wiped off its foundation. Yours might be okay. But everybody has suffered, and so we need to send our prayers down there. They got the hurricane event. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the track, and then we're going to move to the flood event that resulted from the hurricane. I mentioned that the storm went in right over St. Joe's Island and right over the inland bays in the area. It moved inland several miles, but then it did something very strange. There was a high-pressure ridge above it, and it pushed that storm back to the southeast and offshore, which is a very unusual maneuver. Now, going back to Racer's storm, which we talked about in other episodes, that storm moved all the way up the coast from the Yucatan Peninsula all the way to Mobile, Alabama before turning in, and that is a very strange track. But traditionally, hurricanes come straight in and move inland. Well, this one didn't. It came back and started to go back offshore, which, of course, is very dangerous because the warm Gulf waters that spun it into a Category 4 in only 2 days were right there to receive it. And it went a little bit offshore, traveled up the coast, and made landfall between Freeport and Galveston again, and then moved off to the north and the northeast, a more traditional track. Well, the result of that odd track was that the northeast and east side of the storm was east of Victoria for the entire duration until the storm moved north of Houston, and that created conditions that added up to historic rainfall in the Houston area. Now, I've lived my entire life in Houston, and I was around for Tropical Storm Allison, which up until Harvey was the benchmark that we all used, and I was getting some information Thursday. The storm hit the 25th of Friday. I was getting some information Thursday. Some of the weathermen were talking about how this was going to be twice as bad as Allison, twice as much rain, and I sort of chuckled because we all thought during Allison in 2001 that we would never, ever see a rain event like that ever again. It rained 20 to 30 some odd inches in about 24 hours, and it was certainly devastating, and we just thought, well, if you get through Allison, you'll get through anything because we'll never see anything like that again. Well, we were wrong. And so the east and northeast of that storm hovered over the Houston area, and the warm Gulf water, because that storm was just right there on the coast, the warm Gulf water just kept feeding it and feeding it. And it kept dumping that water all over the Houston area. The good news, if there can be any in a situation like this, is that we had plenty of time to prepare in the city, in the area. And when I say Houston, I mean the entire area affected by Harvey did, in fact, prepare. And I think that it's a testament to as much as you can prepare for something like this. And the more I think about it, the more I think you really can't prepare for anything like this. But people did understand what was going to happen, especially those that had been through Allison. And we were as prepared as could be. But you got to remember, as it became more apparent that the meteorologists were right, we were going to get up to 50 inches of rain. There's really nothing you can do. At some point, you realize that the power may go out. You realize we might get a little bit of wind from this storm, not a lot. I don't want to take away from the serious hurricane damage that occurred in the Rockport, Port Aransas area, because Houston did not get that. But when you're talking about these floods, you kind of know the areas of Houston that are going to flood. But the flip side of that is if you live in an area that never flooded, including Allison, you have no perspective on what that kind of rain is going to do. People simply didn't know. And that includes not just homeowners, that includes officials and meteorologists. We just had no idea. No one, with the exception of Hawaii in the early 50s, has ever experienced 50 inches of rain in such a short period of time. And you don't know exactly where that rain is going to fall. So when the storm started to make landfall and the rain bands started coming late Friday night and Saturday to my area of Houston, at that point you get a little nervous. You just got to hope. You got to hope that your area is going to be okay. The area I live in now is near one of the bayous in Houston, and of course we've seen hard rain, but this area wasn't built in 2001 when Allison hit, so we truly did not know what was going to happen, and that certainly is nerve-wracking. Well, another issue that we had during this storm involved some reservoirs to the west of Houston in the area I grew up as a child, and Lake Conroe, which was dug in the 70s as a reservoir. actually to hold and feed the drinking water supply of Houston, not so much as a storm issue. But what happened was the rain fell so much and so fast that the two large reservoirs west of Houston filled up, and there was some danger that they were going to spill over. Now, if it spills over or goes around the end of the levee, you've got a real disaster. So the Corps of Engineers decided to start releasing floodwater at a rate that, coupled with the rainfall on the downriver side of the reservoir, resulted in some serious flooding in western parts of Houston that have never before experienced floods. And that flooding, there are friends of mine who just got into their houses the last couple of days. They've been out of their house. Their house has been underwater for over a week. It destroyed a lot of businesses and has caused some unreal flooding in that area of town. The Lake Conroe spillway was opened, and that resulted in some flooding in some northeastern parts of Houston that had never experienced floods before. And even in a historic river flood in 1994, these houses didn't flood. Well, they did now. And just an untold amount of damage on the northeast side of town. Let me give you some numbers on some Hurricane Harvey additional numbers here. I believe the largest amount of rainfall recorded during the event was 51.88 inches east of Houston in Mont Belvieu. There are varying estimates of the trillions of gallons of water that all this rain equals. Some counts have it as high as 27 trillion gallons of water. I've heard various, and there's just no way you can get any perspective on this, but I've heard some comparisons. One person on the radio said it was like a third of Lake Erie was dumped onto the Houston area. Another person wrote that the amount of rain that fell would fill the Astrodome 86,000 times. I'm not sure you can really understand what that means, but I heard something very interesting yesterday from someone that the weight of all the water that fell on Houston would push the land down 2 inches. And I thought that was a very interesting perspective, the weight of all that water. The highest annual rainfall recorded at one of the Houston airports before Hurricane Harvey. Now, this is for a year. The highest total was 49.7 inches. We got more than that in 3 days. That's unbelievable. Another more current stat compared the rain that fell to the rain that fell in New Orleans during Katrina, which, of course, was a devastating flood for that city. The water levels after Katrina were 10 to 20 feet, even after the levees in New Orleans had failed. The rain that fell on Houston, if it had fallen in New Orleans in the same situation, would have been 128 feet. So it's really just an unreal amount of rainfall that fell on the fourth largest city and its environs in the country. A couple of other interesting stats direct from the flood control district. There's an estimate that 70% of Harris County, now the city of Houston lies within Harris County, but Harris County is much larger than just the city of Houston. 70% of Harris County was covered with up to 1.5 feet of water. That is a huge area. Flood control estimates that 136,000 structures would flood. Now that estimate is done based on property records and the areas that they know, the amount of rain and the amount of water that were in certain areas. So that's not exactly a correct number. I suspect the number is much higher, but that's what the official estimate shows. And it's really just hard to put into words the effect. We did have several dozen people die in connection with this event, and I want to say, and I'll say it again at the end, but I'm not taking anything away from the hurricane event in Port Aransas and Rockport. Nothing at all. That was a serious storm event. Houston, since this happened and I was going through it, that's why I'm kind of focused on this flooding, especially given the size and it was a national or world really historic flood event. But there were some real bright spots in this disaster, and I want to tell you about a few of them. First one I want to talk about, two things: the Cajun Navy and the law enforcement cooperation. My parents, I mentioned, their house flooded. They had to be rescued. It came up very fast. And the Cajun Navy is a group of people from Louisiana who hitch up their boats when a disaster hits, and they drove over here for no other reason than to help people. But they're more than just a bunch of guys with the boats coming over here. They are organized, and we didn't discover this until we were trying to help my parents. My parents, the water from the river came up so fast that there was no time for them to be rescued by a vehicle. We got on the Cajun Navy website, and they were very organized, gave you a number, took a phone number. Everybody got a phone call. Everybody had a tag number to cross-reference the people. And my parents were actually rescued by law enforcement officials, but the Cajun Navy pulled up as they were getting in the boat. The Cajun Navy people who had been dispatched over the internet by a group of private citizens just working to help showed up right away. And so big shout out to the Cajun Navy. Those guys are really, and girls, are really something. There was a great news article in the Chronicle. I'll try to post it on the website about a lady who was looking for a way to help and discovered the Cajun Navy needed some dispatchers, and she writes about her experience doing that, all from her laptop in her house. Really a great story. So the Cajun Navy did some great work. My parents were rescued by game wardens from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, and so obviously big thanks to Florida Fish and Wildlife for doing that. They rescued tons of people over here, and they came all the way from Florida just to help. They didn't have to. They wanted to. And by the way, the Texas game wardens have sent a strike team to Florida to help with Hurricane Irma. The law enforcement, I've seen cars from Arlington, from Fort Worth, from San Antonio. Was helping my parents clean their house out. A Taylor County Sheriff's deputy came up the driveway to check on us. Law enforcement from all over the state of Texas came to Houston and to Port A and to Rockport to help in this disaster. And that's just how Texas is, and that's what we do. And so huge credit to the law enforcement community, our first responders. Firemen, too, they've worked tirelessly during this disaster. Houston set up 2 huge shelters in 2 of our largest structures. We have a convention center downtown, the George R. Brown Convention Center, that became a shelter immediately. Shortly thereafter, the NRG Center, which is where the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo is held, became a shelter. It was very organized. It was operating very quickly. Thousands of people were helped. There was food. There was unbelievable amounts of clothes. In fact, at one point during the storm, everybody just said, "Quit bringing clothes because we just can't handle it." Everyone is too generous, and that's a good problem to have. But everybody came together to help those in the shelters. The Red Cross obviously sets those shelters up and runs them very well. The Salvation Army was absolutely key during this event, and not just in Houston, but also down where the hurricane actually made landfall. They fed thousands of people. The Salvation Army's ability to do that is just unparalleled. They fed the first responders. In fact, there's a great story I heard that the Texas commander of the Salvation Army went down to Rockport, and there were some people that their apartments had been torn down by the storm, and they were really in trouble, and nobody had been there. Nobody had come to them. This was right after the storm, and, everybody's running around doing first responders, obviously prioritizing safety and life safety and fire issues, and he rolled up there to this apartment complex with a food truck and that Salvation Army logo. And one of the people in that apartment looked at him. He saw that logo and said, "I knew you would come." And I just think that's a great story, great testament to what the Salvation Armies do and all these relief organizations do. I had several friends that set up impromptu barbecues, guys that like to cook. It will not surprise any listener that I have a lot of friends that like to cook barbecue. And guys got together and girls, and they set up their barbecue pits, and they just started cooking and feeding police and feeding fire and feeding victims. We were cleaning my parents' house up, and Methodist church from outside the Houston area showed up with lunches, just walked up the driveway and gave them to us. I mean, it's just amazing how the people came together. Downtown Houston, there's something set up called Operation Barbecue, which is feeding all the relief workers and first responders, and barbecue teams, competitive barbecue teams from the area have set up, and they're getting that done. I read a very interesting interview with the president of H-E-B, one of the large grocery chains in Texas that I'm sure all of the Texans listening are familiar with, and some of the things they were able to do. They had, it was kind of interesting. You never think about how this works from a grocery store perspective. They had a lot of stores flooded, but they sent tons of water to Beaumont, and they started to know what to do. Is very interesting. They had, they talked to their suppliers. One of the interview I read, that they sort of bypass the warehouse and they talk to the suppliers of paper goods and tell them to send it directly to the stores, because they need it right out of the stores. And if there's been flooding in these kind of disasters, which of course was the disaster in Houston, that people really want mops, they want bleach, they want bread. They don't care for a while about flours, that sort of thing. They talked about the factory where H-E-B makes its bread, quit making everything except white bread, wheat bread, and hot dog buns, because that's all anybody wants. It was very interesting. You can find that on the internet. I'll try to link to that on the website. One of the great stories to come out of this storm was J.J. Watt, who got on Twitter. Houston Texans football star got on Twitter. He said, I want to raise $100,000. I'm going to match it, and we're going to give it to hurricane relief. Within minutes, he raised the goal to $200,000. J.J. Watt's fund has now raised over $30 million. And that's just a wonderful testament to leveraging what he had to give, which was celebrity, and leveraging that into just tens of millions of dollars for storm victims. And he's done a lot more than just raise money. There are plenty of pictures going around of him out there with the victims, hauling debris, helping his community. One of the things that struck me with all these stories, and as we start to recover, is how surprised people who are not from Texas are. I read an article in a northern newspaper that was just, the guy was struck and just awestruck by the fact that Texans do this, whereas we were sitting around before the storm preparing to do this, preparing to help each other. You shouldn't be surprised. This is just what Texas does. And some of these people who aren't from Texas, who are so gosh darn surprised at how we come together despite race, creed, color, politics, religion, doesn't matter. We're all Texans first. And never does that shine brighter than when some of our fellow Texans are in trouble. And I'm just so proud of this state. Well, Hurricane Harvey, and I want to mention one more time, the people in Port A and Rockport need our help. It's not just Houston. And, of course, the people in Beaumont and the people in western Louisiana, they also need the Beaumont area, not just Beaumont, Orange, Vidor, everyone around there. There's still a lot of work to be done to get past this. But I'll tell you, we're on our way. I'm recording and releasing this on Sunday, September the 10th, 2017. And this morning, at about 8 o'clock Central Time, Hurricane Irma made landfall as possibly the strongest hurricane in recorded history. Now, we don't have records of how strong the 1900 storm was, or Racer storm in 1837. But when Irma made landfall, I believe it to be the strongest hurricane in recorded history. And the people in Florida are suffering that hurricane right now. And I'm going to tell you what I saw yesterday. I was driving from Austin to Houston, and it's a testament, again, to Texans as we're in the midst of recovering from Harvey. I saw a convoy of utility workers waving Texas flags on their trucks on their way down I-10 headed to Florida, because we're Texans, and that's what we do. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas, a bonus episode on Hurricane Harvey. I hope you and yours got through the storm. If you were affected by it, my prayers are with you, the prayers of all Texans are with you. Several people died as a result of Hurricane Harvey, and every life is important, but I want to dedicate this bonus episode to Sergeant Steve Perez of the Houston Police Department. Sergeant Perez was encouraged by his family not to go into work in the middle of the night during this historic rainfall in Houston, but he wasn't going to have it. A 30-year-plus veteran of the Houston Police Department, he did what first responders do. He went toward the storm because he knew he would be needed to help. And unfortunately, an intersection had flooded faster than anyone could have anticipated. And Sergeant Perez was in his patrol car and drove into the high water, was unable to escape, and lost his life serving his fellow man. So this episode of Wise About Texas is dedicated to Sergeant Steve Perez. Well, we made it through Harvey, and we're going to recover. Our prayers go out to the people in Florida dealing with Hurricane Irma right now. Don't worry, Texans are going to be there to help you. The Texas game wardens are already over there, and Florida's going to recover too. Stay safe out there, everyone. Go out there and do something to help the victims of Harvey. Do something to help the victims of Irma. You don't have to donate money. You can go tear sheetrock out. You can go help people recover from this storm. That's doing something for Texas. Until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.